It's December 2017 and there's an elephant in the room. The elephant is incredibly difficult to ignore, but also very difficult for an awful lot of people to talk about, and that is the purpose of this video. The elephant, of course, is Brexit. Brexit is an event which seems likely to overshadow and to shape pretty much everything that grocery businesses do over the next couple of years, not just here in the UK, but probably internationally as well, because it would be a real mistake to assume that Brexit is just a British problem. Now, at the moment, it's still quite difficult for us to say exactly what form Brexit is likely to take, because nationally and internationally, the political situation is still very, very difficult. And of course, there are no historical precedents for us to work from. Nobody has ever left the EU before. It's still possible for us to conjure up any number of different Brexit scenarios, from fairly benign to really quite concerning. Now, in my experience, leaders in the grocery industry tend to be optimists by nature. You'd have to be to take the job on. They tend to look for opportunities. They tend to look for upsides. In the case of Brexit, though, I suggest that it's prudent for us to always look towards the downside, to take a rationally pessimistic view of what Brexit might involve. We should assume a bad exit from the EU, and therefore an unprecedented test of capability for grocery industry. And this is a test of capability that the industry cannot afford to fail. Because if service to consumers is interrupted, if there is disruption to the grocery industry, then there would be welfare impacts for possibly millions of UK citizens. So, in the absence of a clear steer from government, grocery industry leaders need to be self-starters. They need to get cracking on Brexit straight away. If Brexit does indeed lead to significant disruption of the grocery experience, we can expect grocery shoppers to be critical. And it won't just be shoppers. It'll be charities, politicians, the media, really anybody else who has an axe to grind. And of course, where there's criticism, action might follow, action that would take the initiative away from our businesses. Now, so far, it seems that many grocery businesses are quite reluctant to talk, at least to talk publicly, about Brexit and what it might mean. Our own research has proven that there is a distinct lack of dialogue, a lack of inter-business dialogue around this subject. And if Brexit is disruptive, that lack of dialogue might prove very difficult to explain and to defend, because let's face it, grocery businesses have had many years' notice of Brexit. The idea of holding a referendum on Brexit was government policy as early as May 2015. That was a year before the referendum itself. And if there are problems associated with Brexit, I think the industry's critics would be justified in saying, well, why weren't you at least talking about it? You had years. So, our research has shown that inter-business dialogue around Brexit is apparently quite limited at present. And in many ways, that finding was a surprise, because within the UK grocery industry, businesses are actually generally pretty good at talking about issues of mutual interest, and also quite good at working together where appropriate in order to make the system work better. And that, of course, is the purpose of IGD. Our job is to bring businesses together to make the supply chain work better for the benefit of the customer. The problem with Brexit, though, is that the task is so large, it's so nebulous, that often it's very, very difficult to know exactly how to start talking about it. That's why it is the elephant in the room. And because Brexit will potentially affect every business and every job role, dealing with it might not be seen as anybody's job in particular. It's always very tempting in that sort of situation to leave it to somebody else to get the conversation started. What is actually needed is some sort of mechanism, some sort of framework that can get businesses talking internally and with their partners. And that's why we've introduced what we call the Brexit Workout. The aim of the Brexit Workout is to break up the business challenge into small and manageable chunks, and also, where possible, to start business conversations. Well, the first step in the process, of course, is team selection. Any number can play this game, but of course, they have to be the right people. Dealing with Brexit is a very broad challenge, so your team is going to need broad skills. Not just a single individual, not just a single department. We're talking really here about a cross-functional team with a wide range of expertise and deep knowledge of the supply chain. It might also be helpful to start bringing in advisors and colleagues from other businesses within your supply chain, upstream and downstream. Because, of course, unless your whole supply chain is ready for Brexit, that supply chain may well break at the weakest link. All of the people that you involve will also need the right motivations. It might be tempting sometimes for very busy people to assign Brexit preparation a relatively low priority. You get around that through incentives. The people involved in Brexit preparation have to see it as a worthwhile task and potentially a task which will bring them personal advancement. Getting ready for Brexit must be seen as every bit as prestigious, every bit as exciting as, for example, being really good at sales. So, you've assembled your team, you've got everybody around the table. The next step in the Brexit Workout is to decide what Brexit readiness, what Brexit preparation actually means. Because unless you have an agreed definition, of course, it's going to be very difficult to decide whether you're ready or not. Now, to some extent, defining Brexit readiness is going to have to wait until the Brexit deal is done and the accompanying trade deal has been agreed. That will give businesses the exam question. But clarity on those points might not emerge until just before Brexit actually happens. And then there might not be enough time for businesses to get ready. So businesses need to move ahead. They need to set their own definition. And as I said before, it would be worth taking a rationally pessimistic view of what Brexit outcomes might be. Now, if we take a pessimistic view, it might not be realistic for us to expect our shoppers to have a completely uninterrupted service during Brexit. It might be appropriate in that case to set a slightly lower bar, a slightly lower expectation of what service to consumers in the post-Brexit period might actually mean. Here's my definition of what Brexit readiness might mean for a grocery supply chain. And you'll notice that this definition takes in the whole of the supply chain, not just a single business. Also, we allow for the possibility of further shocks beyond Brexit, because for a lot of grocery businesses, the real nightmare scenario might not be Brexit itself, but Brexit in combination with some other crisis, such as a climate change shock or a financial disaster. So, you've assembled your team, you've agreed a definition of what Brexit readiness might mean. You've done the warm-up. Now it's time to do the Brexit workout itself. So, take a single product that your supply chain creates. It could be a best-selling product, or it might be something with particularly complicated international dependencies. Take that product and start to rip it apart. Break it down into all of the necessary inputs. And we're not just talking here about ingredients and packaging. Consider everything you need to make it. So the machines, the capital, the spare parts, the professional services, everything that is necessary. Once you've broken that product down into its component pieces, you can then start to discuss what it is that Brexit might actually do to the supply chain. You can start to identify Brexit risks to each of those individual inputs. And once you've agreed your list of risks, you can then start to agree a list of possible solutions, a list of possible approaches that might harden your product against a worst case Brexit outcome. Of course, even with a single product, understanding all of the risks can still be quite a complicated and daunting task. So to help manage things, to help simplify things, we can start to classify our risks into different types. So for example, I've provided here a 3-part model that classifies risks to a product according to financial risk, product risk, and supply chain risk. And I've filled in a few examples of what might go into each of those boxes. And just to clarify, these examples are purely generic and I've plucked them out of the air just to provide an example. If the 3-part model doesn't work for you, you could try this 4-part Boston box approach. So here I've plotted risks according to 2 different axes, showing how likely it is that something will occur and the potential supply chain impact if it does. And the advantage of doing it this way is that you can start to develop an idea of priority, an idea of order of work. Anything that appears in the top right-hand box should obviously be top priority when it comes to finding solutions. As you do this, you might well find that different members of the supply chain take a very different view as to where risks should be allocated. And of course, you would be best finding this out now rather than later on. Finally, you could try classifying your Brexit risks according to time, that is, according to how quickly they might manifest, because not all Brexit risks will necessarily appear on day one after Brexit. So here I've suggested 4 different time horizons extending out to 1,000 days, or about 3 years. 3 years is about as long as most UK grocery companies are used to planning, at least used to planning in detail. The benefit of this is that you can also start to use it to plan out possible solutions to Brexit, because again, not all solutions to Brexit can be delivered on day one. And the longer something is likely to take to deliver, the sooner work needs to begin on it. So for example, if we think that Irish beef might be difficult to obtain in the UK post-Brexit, it might be necessary to start sourcing more beef within the UK. But bringing beef to market might take up to 3 years. So if you think you want more UK beef after Brexit, you need to get started on that straight away. Speaking of beef, let's take an example. For this worked example, I've chosen to use a hamburger. A good choice, I think, because all of the elements within a hamburger can be easily seen and easily understood. So I've taken my hamburger and I've broken it down to show some of the inputs. The list here, of course, is not comprehensive, it's just an example. And notice that I haven't just used the ingredients. I've also tried to pick out some of the other things that are needed to create the burger, like labour, for example. For each of the items, I've suggested a couple of possible risks. So, for example, in the winter season, as we are now, my hypothetical hamburger is trimmed with lettuce that is sourced from Spain. But it is quite possible that after Brexit, our Spanish supplier will be less interested in supplying the UK if he sees it as being too much trouble. Now that we understand all of the risks to our burger and some of the possible solutions, we can start to plot those out according to the 4-stage time horizon model. So sticking with the lettuce, for example, on day one after Brexit, it's quite possible that our lettuce will be subject to import tariffs when it arrives in the UK. There might also be long delays at the border where those tariffs are assessed and checked. Our day one solution for that might be simply to stock up on lettuce just before Brexit and then to draw down on those locally held stocks. And that might well work perfectly for day one, but it's not going to work forever because it's lettuce. We can't store it indefinitely. From day 10 onwards, we might just have to swallow the cost of the extra import tariff. But what we could do perhaps is fly the lettuce into the UK in order to avoid some of those delays at port. Looking further ahead, well, beyond 1,000 days, it might be possible for us to start developing new sources of lettuce within the UK, thus getting around all of the import problems altogether. But that's not going to happen straight away. We need to start working on that now with a view to delivery some years down the line. Once you've completed your Brexit workout, you can then work with your partners to start applying some of your findings to the whole of your product supply chain. But you need to go further. You also need to start considering wildcard factors that might intervene. And by wildcard factors, I'm talking about forces that will act on your supply chain from the outside, which you must at least consider, even if they're not always that easy to account for. Now, on this chart, I've suggested 6 possibilities, and I won't go into these in detail, except just to clarify 2. The first one of those is what I call the hidden inputs. The hidden inputs are the bits of your supply chain which are not always immediately obvious, even to a specialist. And that's why we always advise wide consultation with as many supply chain participants as possible, because other people may be aware of supply chain inputs that you know nothing about. And the capacity question, well, that's intended to discuss what might happen if multiple businesses settle on a particular solution at the same time. So if we go back to the hamburger example, flying in lettuce from Spain makes perfect sense if it's just one business doing it. But if every burger company within the UK decides to do exactly the same time, we might well start to run into air freight capacity challenges. You've done the Brexit workout. You've assembled a plan. You've considered the possible impact of wildcard events. Now you need to stress test the plan. And I would suggest doing this in much the same way as banks are stress tested, by applying various different financial scenarios to check whether or not your supply chain still works and is still profitable for everybody. And here I've suggested 5 possible stress tests that you can do. In each case, I would suggest asking yourself, exactly what price would we have to sell our product at in order for everybody to remain profitable? The tests are fairly self-explanatory. The only one that needs a little bit of explanation is perhaps the one about interest rates and base rates. Now, I've suggested stress testing with a 5% base rate, and that seems to be huge after more than a decade of near zero interest rates. But it is worth considering that in the 10 years before the banking crisis hit, now a decade ago, the average UK base rate was actually 4.8%. So 5% is really not excessive. 5% might be seen as being normal. My time's up. It's time to finish. Hopefully this video has given you some useful food for thought, even if some of it was at times a bit unpalatable. It's time to draw the threads together. These are the key points that I want to leave you with, and I've presented them in the form of talking points. That is to say, things to ask yourself, things to ask your colleagues. But of these, the most important one is probably the last. The chances are that Brexit is going to have to be dealt with by this generation of grocery industry leaders and grocery industry professionals. That is, the people watching this video right now. So I would challenge you to go back to your desk, to ask yourself and to ask your colleagues, what are you doing? What are you as individuals doing to prepare your business, your supply chain and your industry for Brexit? Because your shoppers are going to want to know. That's all from me. Thank you for listening.